This is all about making a new, a fresh start.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Sorry for the technical delay, but we are back and on track. Isn't it great, though, the way that books just always open? And, you know, you never have to worry about whether they have the battery charge or whether it's got the right login credentials. You just open up a book and there it is. And, of course, this is perhaps the best book to be opening up. I don't mean the Torah. I mean, there are different versions of our translations, as we were talking about before we started, each of which has something special to add. But we're not going to deal with translation issues today. We're going to deal with fundamental ideological issues, and ones that hopefully continue to motivate us to look at Torah and our own society around us in good, difficult ways. With that, and since we lost 10 minutes, we're going to jump straight in without more preamble. We are going to be looking at chapter 17 of Deuteronomy. And we're going to start up on verse 8. This is on page 1090 if you're using the Eitz Chaim. Like I said, chapter 17 if you're using any other copy. And we are in Parashat Shoftim. Now, the beginning of Shoftim deals with Shoftim. It deals with judges. And we're going to just finish up part of that discussion at the bottom of page 1090. And I need a volunteer. Thank you.
If a case is too baffling for you to decide, be it a controversy over homicide, civil law, or assault, matters of dispute in your courts, you shall promptly repair to the place that the Lord your God will have chosen and appear before the Levitical priest or the magistrate in charge at the time and present your problem.
All right, so pause real quick. What we're dealing with here is a slight variation on what we recognize as being an appellate court system, right? In our system, you have local courts, and so if I were to cheat someone in business, they would take me to court, and we'd go to that court. And then if I didn't like the verdict, I could appeal that verdict to a higher court, and eventually we'd get all the way up to Supreme Court in the American system. This is not that system. This is not an appellate court system. This is a stumped court system. So imagine you go to your local court and they say, I cheated them, I say I didn't, we present all the evidence, and the court goes, wow, does that really fit the definition? No, this is a case of the likes of which we've never seen. There's no precedent. There are no previous rulings that match this type of situation. We don't know how to rule. Then the court, not the litigants, the court kicks it upstairs and says to the courts that are above them, guys, little help, could you make a ruling? And in particular, it goes to the Sanhedrin being the court that would eventually be permanently seated in Jerusalem. And they would then make rulings on cases that no one else could figure out. And their rulings then would become precedent and would become law. And then all lower courts would be expected to rule in that manner for like cases in the future. Make sense? So that's what we're dealing with here. It's not the litigants appealing. It is the court appealing for help from a higher source, if you will, a more robust legal authority. And that authority word is very important for our discussion, because
when they have announced to you the verdict in the case, you shall carry out the verdict that is announced to you from the place that the Lord chose, observing scrupulously all their instructions to you. You shall act in accordance with the instructions given you and the ruling handed down to you. You must not deviate from the verdict that they announced to you, either to the right or to the left.
All right, so pause there real quick, because I want to make sure we got this concept of the authority of the Sanhedrin, of this highest court to render verdicts. When the court says that in the case of cheating of Rabbi Neely versus so-and-so Smith, that the court finds that Rabbi Neely did in fact cheat him because what he did was a violation of some other point, that is now halakha. That is the law. It's not their interpretation of the law. That becomes part of the body of halakha, and to deviate from it is the equivalent of deviating from Torah. which is something that takes a while for us to get our head around. The closest that we get in American law is the constitutional decisions of the Supreme Court. Right? They don't always decide things as constitutional matters, but when they do, when they say the Constitution guarantees that you have to have your rights read to you, when they say that, they're not making laws, they're not adding to the laws, they are declaring that within the Constitution is this action implicit. And therefore, all they're doing is making it explicit. And now everybody has to follow it because everybody's bound by that same Constitution, and they're the ones who told you what it meant. That is an incredible amount of authority, because their reading of Torah, their reading of Jewish law, becomes Jewish law. Capiche? Right? It's most Americans are a little uncomfortable with that. You know, even though we respect the Supreme Court, we always still have our own, well, you know, minority opinion, dissenting opinion, blah, 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 blah. It's like, yeah, but as long as the majority opinion has ruled, that is the law of the land. Now,
well, it doesn't become, it's saying that it is and always has been Jewish law.
Exactly, exactly. They are simply declaring that what they have to, that the law has always been this way. Now, does that mean that the Sanhedrin can't change its mind? Yes, the Sanhedrin can change its mind, but you can't change its mind. That is to say, you can't say the Sanhedrin made a mistake, therefore I'm going to act differently. The Sanhedrin can say the Sanhedrin from 100 years ago was in error, or we have new information, or our interpretation is more robust, and therefore we're going to rule differently. But you as an individual are not allowed to act in that way. You can feel it, you can think it, you can even argue it, but as soon as it comes to action, you are bound by whatever the Sanhedrin decreed. Very important to note, there is no current Sanhedrin in Judaism, right? So there is no official group that can tell you this is Jewish law in a way that is accepted by the entirety of the Jewish people. Not usually accepted even by more than just a small sliver of the Jewish people. So this is a hypothetical situation, but it's going to be very important for our understanding of the lines of authority within Jewish thinking. Okay. So what happens if you don't listen?
Should a man act presumptuously and disregard the priest charged with serving there the Lord your God, or the magistrate, that man shall die. Thus you will sweep out evil from Israel. All the people will hear and be afraid and will not act presumptuously again.
Disregarding the final verdict of the Sanhedrin is a capital offense. All right, so if, you know, in the case of Rabbi Neely versus Mr. Smith, they come down and say Rabbi Neely cheated him, even though it was only an interpretation of Jewish law, right? Some very technical reason why that counts as cheating. And I say, I'm not going to pay the $150 fine that you've given me, because I still don't believe that your interpretation of Torah is correct. I could be executed.
This is one of the great arguments in favor of the death penalty in current thought is people will hear or see and will be afraid, and so they won't act in that way.
All right, so deterrence.
Deterrence. There's a deterrent factor in if you see somebody being incarcerated or prosecuted for a behavior that should, you know, move you to not do it.
But why do we care? Let people be presumptuous.
Upon to perform the execution.
You mean how does that? Well, I mean, there would need to be a separate trial to prove that I had actually been presumptuous and to confirm that I had deliberately disobeyed the rulings of the court. It wasn't just that I was,
well,
you know.
Said the person will die. Well, we'll all die.
Well, yeah, that is true. But this is talking about an execution. But this deterrence. What is so wrong with people acting presumptuously like this? I mean, so fine. I say, I don't want to pay. I think the court's wrong and I'm not going to do it. And so the sheriff comes to my house. So, but imagine the sheriff then would come to my house. He'd take the $150 from my wallet. He'd give it to Mr. Smith that I had cheated. We're all happy, right? I can stand there and say, meh, and they'll take my money away and give it to the person that the court says I owe. I can still be righteously indignant and presumptuous. He gets the money that the court said he was supposed to get to. Why do I need to die just because I won't acknowledge the court's ruling? What is it that the Torah is afraid of when it says that we need to make sure?
Rebellion. It's rebellion against law and order.
It is a fundamental rebellion against law, against order, against the structure of authority. It is the seeds of anarchy.
Every man becomes a law unto himself.
Right. Each person, if they are allowed to not only act presumptuously, but even deny the authority of the court to make a ruling, becomes a sliver in the body of the nation that will eventually tear it apart. It's one more little crack, one more little chisel. And even if the court is able to rely on their power, not their authority, but their power to extract the penalties or to extract the fines or to extract punishment from people, if there is a deliberate rebelliousness against the authority of the court to make those decisions, not against their power because they have too much, but against their authority, then the entire system breaks down. And this is very true in the modern world as well. If there is not respect for the institutions that we have that are meant to embody our nation and provide justice and provide fairness for everyone, then even if we are compelled to go along with its rulings, the whole thing begins to unravel. And the more it unravels, the worse things get. Now, ideally, everyone should always be happy and agree with the final decisions, but we all know that that's not going to happen when I'm the one being stuck with the penalty. Everyone has a self-interest to deny the authority of the court whenever the court rules against them. And that is exactly what would happen in every case where the law was the least bit ambiguous. People would always deny the rightness of a verdict if it meant they could escape punishment. And in fact, in our appellate court system, that is almost entirely what you see. If people think there's any room for being able to overturn the verdict, not on the rightness of the judgment, but on the technicality, they'll take it. Even if they know in their heart that they were wrong, even if everybody is clear that the law is against them, if they think that there is some way they can undermine the way the judge handled the trial, the way that the jury was selected, the way evidence was presented, it doesn't matter whether jury, evidence, and judge were all fair and reached the right conclusion. If they think there's a place that they can question the authority of that verdict, they will if it will help them. And this is basically saying, no, that's not the right way that you should be approaching the law. If there is an actual problem, you are allowed to ask until it reaches a certain level, at which point we're done, right? We're done. That seems a little dictatorial. Wait till you get to the king. Next paragraph.
If after you've entered the land that the Lord your God has assigned you and taken possession of it and settled in it, you decide, I will set a king over me, as do all the nations about me. You shall be free to set a king over yourself, one chosen by the Lord your God. Be sure to set as king over yourself one of your own people. You must not set a foreigner over you, one who is not your kinsman.
All right, so pause there for a second. Are we commanded to have a king?
No.
Why not? Because of that word if? Look at the Hebrew. Does it say im, which is the traditional word that is used in Hebrew for meaning an if? No, ki tavo, right? When you enter, or as you enter into the land, and you say. Does that imply choice, or does that imply obligation? Or does it imply inevitability? It's inevitable that we will want a king. So when you enter the land of Israel, unlike now here in the wilderness with me, Moses, your leader, you will say that you want to have a king like all the other nations. We just want to fit in, right? I want to wear the same shoes that everybody else wears. You're going to want to fit in. And when you do that, here are the limits that are placed upon that decision. Does that mean God is saying, yay, monarchy? Or is he saying, monarchy? What's God's attitude then towards having a king? And what authority does that king then have? What's that?
If you read the rest of the Tanakh, it's like, it's God is always, and the prophets are always saying, you have to have you want a king, and of course they pick a person who they think looks like a king.
He was tall.
He was tall.
Good old tall King Saul.
I mean, he would look presidential.
He's letting them have what they want.
Because God is known for just letting us always have what we want, right? If God let us have what we want, people would have bacon for breakfast. And God would say, okay, so that's why in this case, if we're going with the idea that this is a choice, which I should point out, right? I should point out there are many commentators who say this is not about a choice. This is a commandment, that we will have a king and that we must have a king at the right time. But there are many others, as we'll see, that argue that no, this is about a choice. But if this is a choice, and if this is what we want to do, why in this case would God let us do what we want to do, as opposed to all the other cases and the other mitzvot, where it's precisely what we want to do that God's telling us not to do, or what we don't want to do that God's trying to tell us you gotta do?
There's something both, but it also has to be one chosen by God.
Okay, so So
you may want it, but unless there's evidence that this is one chosen by God, you still have that hurdle to.
And it can't be someone who's not.
And you can't pick a foreigner.
And it can't be a foreigner, too many horses, too much gold, too many wives.
Right, there are many, many limits that are put on, and because of our time, we're going to leave those for personal study. Many, many limits are put in place for the king. Foremost among them, that he has to have a copy of the Torah and has to read it, meaning that the king actually needs to recognize God and recognize that he is bound by Torah as well. So the king doesn't get to do whatever he feels like. The king still is limited by Torah, even though he will have authority over the nation. But this question of, is a king good? Is a king bad? Is a king God's recommendation? Is a king God's accommodation to us? This has stirred up many good commentaries, and we're going to look at just a few of them. But first, we're going to look at one of the most famous sections. Yes.
It says that, one chosen by the Lord your God.
Yes.
So this is somebody that God chose. And then after God's chosen him, it says, be sure that he's not a foreigner. Is it possible God might choose a foreigner?
No, but it's possible that we might misinterpret that this foreigner was chosen by God. That is to say, when it says God chose, it's not as though there's going to be a gentleman walking down the street with a large halo over his head that spells out in neon, "This is your king," meaning that God's choosingness is always going to be open to interpretation. Remember, when God chose Saul, many people didn't necessarily agree with that. When God went ahead and chose David, lots more people didn't accept that. In particular, Saul was very unhappy with that selection. And so it would be very easy for someone to say, this is the guy God wants to be king. And people would look at him and say, but he's not even Jewish. And people would say, he's Jewish enough. Take, for example, Herod. Later Jewish history, right? Who was from Idumea. He was kind of Jewish, thanks to the Hashmonean conquest of his area. But it was a forced-ish, conversion-ish. It was a real mess.
Well, he's got married.
Yeah, and then he married well, and then he killed them. So, which was, great guy that I hear. It's Herod the Great, yeah. You have to finish the next word. The great murderer, the great torturer. He was a great builder. That's about the only thing he did that was worthy of the title great.
Things he was building after someone he was going to kill.
Yeah, well, it was a nice way to give you a heads up that you were about to be murdered and assassinated. Okay, but let's go back to the beginning. In the book of Samuel, when we get our first king, the people come to Samuel, the prophet at the time, and they're asking for a king. So if you could read, and this is the abridged version, please go read this section. It is an amazing statement about what it means to have a leader.
All the elders assembled and came to Samuel and said, you have grown old, and your sons have not followed your ways.
They're accepting bribes. They are immoral and terrible guys, which means when he dies, if they're the ones we're left with in charge, this is going to be a problem.
Therefore, appoint a king for us to govern us like all other nations.
All right. Well, wow, that sounds really familiar. That sounds exactly like what we hear in the book of Deuteronomy. That at some point we're going to ask for this.
The Lord replied to Samuel, heed the demand of the people.
All right, God approves.
Or listen to them. And everything they say to you. For it is not you that they have rejected, It is me they have rejected as their king.
Or maybe God doesn't like this. God's saying, go ahead and do it. But in doing so, they are rejecting me. Right? That the real king is supposed to be God, but the people want to have a king, an actual human king, and in doing so, they are rejecting God. They are spurning God as being the only monarch in their life. They would like a flunky, if you will. And God says, okay, I'm going to give him that. I would argue this sounds like a concession at this point, that this doesn't sound like God is saying, yay, monarchy, but more to sort of, I was meant to be your king, but if you can't see me as your king enough to follow and to obey and to be inspired, okay, you can have this guy, right? And he'll be my little puppet that you will be impressed with.
But the people would not listen to Samuel's warning.
Which you should go back and read those intermediate verses of his warnings, which detail exactly the kinds of crimes that kings commit.
No, they said, we must have a king over us, that we may be like all other nations. Let our king rule over us and go out at our head and fight our battles.
All right, so I didn't include it because I was running out of space, but just a little observation of the difference between the beginning of the paragraph and the bottom. Who's asking for a king at the start of the paragraph?
The elder.
The elders, exactly. And what are the elders asking for? Very precisely.
A king to govern.
To govern us like the other nations. What are the people asking for? Because it's not the elders.
They want a warrior.
And more than that,
They want someone to rule over them.
they want someone to rule over us. We want a warrior to fight our battles. And we want to be like other nations, right? The elders are saying we need governance because this whole tribal system, it's not going so well. We need governance in order that we can be governed in the same way that other nations are working. We've looked at them and they've got kings, and when they get kings, it seems to quiet down all of the intertribal rivalry and problems. So having a king leads to good governance. That's what they're arguing in the beginning. At least that's what many commentators point out. Whereas the people, not the elders, but the people, say, we want a king so we can be the same as other nations. Not so we get good governance, but that so we become more like them. Right? This is the equivalent of sticking the organ in the middle of the service, because that's what they do. Not because it's actually beautifying the service, not because it uplifts people in prayer, but just because I want to be like them. And that's the flaw here. Having a king for good governance is one thing. Having a king because it makes you more like other nations just to be like them is a much more difficult concept, and one which is leading, I believe, towards this notion that we want to be like them because we want to have a big bully at the top too, right? Because that seems to be what nations do, right? When nations feel powerful, they've got a big, mighty guy at the top who's out there smashing heads. And that makes me, as peasant of said nation, feel better. Even if the governance isn't any better, because that's not my big concern. My big concern is how do I feel as part of this?
And there was a feel, the people were demoralized.
Oh, absolutely.
Had been trashed, the ark had been stolen. There was a lot.
Exactly. And of course,
there was a lot to be sad about.
There was a lot. And what was the implied subtext of God's response to all of this? Which is, if you want things to be better, you don't need the strong man. If you want things to be better, you need me, God. And that is why God is so upset about the attitude. Again, it doesn't necessarily prove one way or the other about God's ideal feelings towards an ideal monarchy, but his feelings towards this reason for wanting a monarchy are definitely very negative. Right? If you want a monarchy just to be like them, you've got a problem. If you want a monarchy so you can be more successful at being like me, I can live with that, at least. Or maybe it's essential. We don't know.
I've always been touched in this part with the fact that God seems to recognize that Samuel will feel so defeated.
Oh, he did.
And just so crushed that enough that God says,
it's not you, it's me.
It's me.
Before we go, there's one quick thing. From here, we do derive the importance of governing with the consent of the governed.
Do we?
The people
I mean,
have to have a buy-in.
Maybe. Well, let's see what our commentaries say about that, because
There's an argument.
there's an argument, but we got to make the argument. They went around. That's last week's. If we have a few extra handouts from this week for the Shoftim, great. All right, so let's go ahead and look at Sforno.
A monarch whose authority will be transferred from him to his biological heir after his death throughout the generations is quite different from judges, each of whom is appointed for his lifetime, with his heirs having absolutely no claim to succeed their father.
So remember, we started off in the Torah portion talking about judges, and then we switched to kings. And so Sforno wants to see what's the difference between these. And he's saying, yeah, kings, that's hereditary biology. Judges, no. My kids will not automatically become rabbis. Just because I'm a rabbi doesn't give them any authority or standing in the community. If they study, if they grow, then they can become, and if they're accepted by a community. But there's nothing to do with the fact that they're my kids.
Was Samuel a judge?
Samuel did serve as a judge, exactly. He was not only a judge, he was also a prophet, which gave him additional standing and wisdom. But that was his role. And his kids, as we found out, they were definitely not following in Dad's footsteps, even though they were acting as judges. That is to say, they were handling cases and other situations, but they were taking bribes in the process. So these guys were ones that the community was not going to want as their leaders when Samuel was out of the picture. Okay, onward.
The people were commanded to appoint such a hereditary position of king after they had conquered and settled in the land of Israel. The principal reason being to ensure that the Jewish people would not be like a flock without a shepherd.
All right, so Sforno seems to think that this is actually a commandment, right? Not an option, but a commandment. You must have a king. And his primary motivation is sheep need a shepherd, right? And that's not just like modern stupid sheep, but even ancient sheep that were not as dumb as the ones we've bred into stupidity in the 1800s. Even old sheep, tough sheep, mountain sheep, they still need a shepherd, right? They need something to lead them. And Sforno's idea here is that, based off Moses' own words in Numbers, that you need a shepherd. You need someone in the front. You need someone to lead the way. And God recognized that that was going to be necessary in the future, and that we should have, therefore, a king.
The warnings throughout Jeremiah, when the people are left like a sheep without a shepherd, then these things are going to happen.
Exactly. The only question to Sforno's interpretation, however, is this is 400 years after we entered the land. So were we wrong for not having a king before here? Or is this now the right time to have a king and the other 400 years were just practice? It's a little still ambiguous. It's not a slam dunk argument that we have to have a king. Because if we had to have a king from when we settled the land, why have we waited hundreds of years before we got around to it? So, Tur HaAroch.
Rambam writes that according to the sages...
This is Ramban, right? Right. This is Nachmanides, not Maimonides.
All right, Ramban writes that according to the sages, though it sounds optional, depending on the will of the people, it is one of the 613 mitzvot.
All right, so his interpretation of a major line of argument in the Talmud is, this is a commandment, this is not a option that God's giving us. This is not a choose your own governance. You will have a king. Even though it sounds like an option, it's an actual obligation. And he goes on to try and make that case.
It is one of the three that would not become operational until after the people were firmly established in the land.
Right. This is why we didn't need a king in the wilderness. This is also why we didn't need a king when Joshua. It wasn't why we didn't need a king for some of the period of Judges. That seems to be the implication.
It is similar to the law about making a railing on top of the roof of your house.
Right, which is, God gave us that commandment while we lived in tents and Sukkot. And no one was going up on the roof of the sukkah to like dry their clothes. So why give us that law there? That law was meant for once we'd settled in the land of Israel. And when you settle the land, then you need to start putting these parapets up on your roof. And so too, at a certain point in your future, you'll need a king. It was just a front loading of the information, even though it wasn't going to be needed for a very long time.
The reason why Moses prefaces this commandment with the words, when you will say is that the request to appoint a king must originate with the people, and they in turn have to submit it to the ruling authority at that time, the high court.
All right, so he tries to neatly tie up the other part. It's if this is actually a commandment rather than just an option, then why does it say when the people say? Because it shouldn't matter what the people say, right? God doesn't say when the people say, let's keep Shabbat, this is how you keep Shabbat. God says, you will keep Shabbat, and you'll do it in this way. He doesn't wait for us to request Shabbat before those laws kick in. What's his answer to it? It's, yes, this is a commandment, but it's a commandment that will be triggered by popular request. Once the people recognize the need for the king, then a king will become mandatory. That's his final analysis. What do we think? Convinced? Unconvinced? Not about forget what you know about different kings and forget about how many bad kings we had.
It's like a springing power of attorney, which I just had to actually do one for my mom. When this happens, you'll know if you're going to need it at that time, but we don't know when. We just know at some future time you're going to need this. So,
and when it happens, it's binding.
And when it happens, it happens.
Right. And it's not a maybe it will, maybe it won't. It will eventually happen, and this is how you handle it. What do we think? Sound like a good read of the section of Deuteronomy that we did? Right? Chapter 17 all makes sense now. It's not, it's conditional on the will of the people, but it is inevitable that there will be a monarchy. And that is God's choice to have the monarchy. It's not God being upset. It's not God making an accommodation. It's God simply recognizing that there are stages in the development of a nation, and an ultimate stage is going to be king. And it's going to be a little bit different getting there than some of the other commandments. But just like putting a railing around your house, you have to have a house that's a certain height before you need it. You have to have a country that's a certain type before you need the king. But it's okay. But you will need one eventually. And this is how you're going to do it when you get it. Make sense? Maybe? All right, I don't see a whole 100% agreement. Let's see ha'amek davar.
The explanation of saying is not like its simple meaning, but rather like in the phrase, Deuteronomy 12:20, and you shall say, I want to eat meat.
Right, so this is talking about when you say you want to eat meat, this is how you handle it, which sounds also like this is all an optional situation, but it's inevitable that you will eat meat. So by saying, if you want to eat meat, you'll handle it, God's not giving us an open choice. He's simply saying the timing will be unpredictable perhaps, but it's inevitable nonetheless.
However, according to this usage, it is implied that this is not an absolute commandment to appoint a king, but rather optional. However, it is known in the words of the sages that it is a mitzvah to appoint a king. But if so, why is it written, and you shall say?
All right, let's nail this down.
It appears that it is because the government of a state depends upon whether it is run by a monarchy or according to the opinion of the people and its representatives. There are states that can't support a monarchy, and there are states that without a king are like a ship without a captain.
All right, let's make sure we got what he's talking about here. Right, what he's saying is that different countries have different political cultures. And in some country, they need a king. Right? It's just the way that the people are, right? The culture of leadership, the culture of their society structure, the way that the people are temperamentally inclined means that they need a king. And if you try to shove a representative democracy on them, it's just not going to work. They'll be like a ship without a rudder.
When did he write?
Hundreds of years ago.
Because he sounds,
yeah.
A lot of the Greek and early Roman.
Oh, yeah.
Sounded like some states are appropriate for this type of government, other states.
Exactly.
And some other cultures can be governed this way. It depends on.
A fascinating commentator.
But we're dealing with the Jewish culture.
Ah. So shouldn't God know? right? I mean, we're going to be temperamentally towards a king or against a king. This isn't God just saying generally for every nation whether they should have a king or not.
We're talking about this nation.
Exactly. So where's the ambiguity? The ambiguity is the culture and temperament of a nation will change. At times, we will be more temperamentally inclined towards representative democracy, and at times we might be more temporarily inclined towards monarchy. And when that temperamental incline happens, that's when the monarchy begins to kick in. Except he's still trying to make this idea that this is a commandment, which is where he's going to continue to justify.
Such a thing cannot be done according to the coercion of a positive mitzvah, since a matter that is relevant to the government of the public touches upon mortal danger, which pushes off a positive mitzvah.
Right? So if there's a positive commandment and there's a mortal danger, you don't do the positive commandment, right? The positive commandment is to do Kiddush, but if there is a danger of lifting your class from, a lightning strike or whatever, or there's a, leopard right above you, you throw down the glass and you run away, right? You don't say, well, I've got to do the mitzvah, even though it means my certain death or even likely death. No, you don't do a positive commandment when it's going to create mortal danger, right? Therefore, God couldn't command us to have a king because in many circumstances, the temperament of the country at different generations and different stages of its development would have meant the monarchy would lead to the destruction of our people rather than the help.
Thus, it is impossible to absolutely command the appointment of a king so long as it is without the consent of the people to support the yoke of the king as a result of their seeing states around them functioning more properly. And then it is a positive commandment for the Sanhedrin to appoint a king. I'm sure you wanted that. It is.
Yep, it is. So where he comes down in this really great compromise position is it's up to the will of the people. But once the will of the people is spoken, then we are commanded to carry it out and put a king in place. If the people say they need a king because they recognize in it the betterment of the country, of how the country will work better, then the Sanhedrin can't say, no. But it's only in a case where the people have themselves voluntarily stated, and correctly so, that they are willing to abide by the rule of a king. As if they're not willing to put up with it, if they're not willing to tolerate a monarchy, then creating a monarchy is only going to do more harm than good.
It's the consent of the people again.
It's the consent of the people.
It's not dispositive, but it's relevant.
Right. Now, we're good Americans, at least I think most of us are. At least most of us, I believe, have also grown up in representative democracies. You may think it's a little weird that someone would ever vote for king, right? All those in favor of giving up your own liberty and freedom in order to have a hereditary monarchy that will rule over you, your children, your grandchildren, great-grandchildren forever, raise your hand. What, we're electing king? That, to an American, that sounds just totally wacko.
But they used to do it, the archery. I have served these people well. I served you well. My father did. My grandfather did. You should give me and my family the authority to.
Time and time again, countries have gone from democracy, or at least relative democracy, towards monarchies, right? Most famous example being Rome. Rome began as a republic, and then they eventually appointed Caesar. They didn't go from Caesar towards democracy the way we did from, King George to American democracy. They went the opposite direction. And so too throughout different times of representation in Italy, representations in France. There have been high and low points of representation in parts of Germany and England. Back and forth between democracy and monarchy is not that weird. It's actually been fairly common throughout human history.
Spain famously did it over the past generation or so.
Yep.
Right. Monarchy to Franco
and you may also remember, although there was a little fiddling, the Nazi party came to power through a democracy in Germany. The dictatorial powers that they took afterwards is probably not what the people were all voting for, but they at least got into power because of democracy, and people voted for them knowing that the Nazi party had no interest in perpetuating democracy. So the idea that people would vote away their rights to ever be able to vote again is not as ludicrous as this sounds. Make sense? Okay. Unfortunately, yes. Okay. A little bit more.
The fact is that God disapproved of a hereditary type of monarchy, such as customary among the Gentile nations, so that he stipulated that if the people insisted on appointing a king who would start a dynasty, the initial king had to be approved not only by the people, but by God's representative on God's behalf, as we know from Samuel, book 1, chapter 8.
All right, so this is Sforno, who you may remember at the very beginning, the second paragraph said that, yeah, this is kind of a commandment, but this was a commandment that God was not terribly happy about, which we're going to have to come back of. Why is this a commandment that's also an accommodation? But the first thing he's drawing our attention to is that we know that this was only an accommodation rather than a hooray, God loves this kind of commandment, because of all the limitations that God put in place when it was going to be carried out and instituted. Keep going.
The restrictions in appointing the original king were designed to ensure that a king could not lead the people away from God's Torah. We may view the permission to appoint a king as in the same category as the permission for a soldier to marry a prisoner of war.
Right. Very famously within Deuteronomy, there is a section which, if a guy goes out to battle, he falls in love with a captive, she is given time to mourn, and there is a sort of cooling off period for his ardor, and then he is allowed to marry her. It's a very unusual and for many people a very unsettling mitzvah that he is allowed to essentially take a woman against her will and make her into one of his wives. Now, there are limitations on how he does that, on how he can treat her, and how he treats the children that come from that marriage. And that is the parallel that Sforno was trying to draw here. Is just as God does not say, you go and find a captive and you bring her home and you force her to marry you, but instead says, if you're going to do this, this is the way you've got to do it. So too for the monarchy. God is saying, it's inevitable that you're going to want this, and if you're going to do it, here's the way you've got to do it. I'd rather you didn't, but I know what you're like, because you're human, and you're stiff-necked and stubborn and willful and reject me at every turn. So I know you're going to do this eventually. So at least let me try and point you in the right direction as you make the biggest mistake of your life.
God, the master psychologist, knows that sometimes in order to become wise enough to appreciate the Torah's prohibitions, an individual or even a whole nation must find this out by having chosen in their own wisdom to ignore the Torah's preferences.
Right? So, I mean, it's just a great line. God is smart enough to know that you need to be allowed to be dumb in order for you to eventually be wise. Because if God never lets you mess up, you'll never learn. So what he's essentially saying here is all of the failed kings that came throughout our period of the Tanakh when we had kings, those were God's lessons to us that kings are bad.
Psychologists know that most people reach an age, you can teach children out of a book and they absorb, and
right.
Most people hit this age in late adolescence where they have to learn by experience.
Right.
Adults have to learn by making a mistake, and so too communities and nations.
Yeah, try telling your kid, oh, I don't want you to date so-and-so because they're the wrong sort of person. That always works so well. It doesn't mean we won't end up saying those things to our kids at different times, but at a certain age, chances are they're going to have to experience the heartbreak and disappointment of having a relationship with someone like that in order for them to avoid it in the future. And our job is to mitigate the damage that relationship might cause them. This is God's attempt to mitigate the damage a monarchy might cause us. And then he very pointedly brings an interesting example.
David's experiences with his son, Absalom, born to such a prisoner of war whom he married because he was initially physically attracted to her, bears this out. In fact, his experience with his son, Adoniah, was not much better.
Right. So when we look at David's own life experiences, we can see the whole war captive thing played out, but we can also see that hereditary monarchies are kind of a crapshoot, roll of the dice of whether the kids are going to be even decent human beings, let alone good kings. So, yeah, says Forno, this wasn't God saying, go kings. This was God saying, you're going to have to learn this the hard way, but I'm going to try and put at least a bit of a safety net in place. And to round that off, and in a similar vein, we're going to get something from Abarbanel. And Abarbanel, as you may remember, was from the 1400s and 1500s. So this is before the Enlightenment, before you got Locke and Mills and all of those guys. But look what he's talking about of the difference between a monarchy or any form of authoritarianism and representative democracy.
It is fitting that we know if a king is a necessary and intrinsically obligatory thing for a nation, or whether it is possible without him.
All right, so just make sure, he's saying that the question we've been wrestling with for like the last 45 minutes, this is an incredibly important question. This is not just a matter of historical interest, of whether God wanted us to have a King David or not have a King David. Knowing whether God believes that the best organization of a society is under a monarchy or whether the best organization of a society is under some other form of governance matters always.
The philosophers thought it was needed.
That is to say, a king.
Right, and that the dominion of a king to a nation is like the relationship of the heart to the body.
You can't have a body without a heart.
And like the relationship of the first cause to the world more generally.
First cause was the philosopher's term for God, right? The whole universe was created by a first cause. Therefore, a nation, it looks to a singular point for its existence, for its structure, for its governance. And you can't do it any other way. That was the line of many of the philosophers of his day and antiquity.
These analysts reason that monarchy ensures three things. 1, unity and the absence of division. 2, continuity and stability. 3, absolute power.
Right, you need all three of those. And you may remember when we were talking about the first section of our parasha earlier, that we talked about the absolute power of the judges, of the rules, right? That when a judgment has been made by the Sanhedrin, that becomes binding and absolute upon the nation. And that the king was being brought in as a second level of consideration. So those are the three different topics. So I just want to remind you that in case you all thought that having the idea of absolute power was just bad. We're well-trained Americans and we resent the idea of absolute power, but a nation needs to have power.
This is the outline. James I of England wrote a very famous book called The Divine Right of Kings, and this is the outline of the
basic idea, exactly. But their argument here isn't that God necessarily will pick each king, although obviously we want our kings to be chosen through divine selection. Their argument of the philosophers is that a nation simply can't function without a king, right? Godly chosen or not, you need to have someone at the top with a shiny hat that is able to point a scepter at you and you live or die. And if you don't have that, your nation is in trouble. And Abarbanel is arguing against that.
But their thinking is actually false. It can't be denied that there can be many leaders of the people that gather and unite and agree upon one policy, and that the leadership and law be according to them. And this goes against claim 1. Right,
so we need to avoid absence, we need to avoid the division. We need to have unity, right? So therefore, we need one king. What Abarbanel's argument is no, you need one body, right? One legal body.
One policy, one leadership.
Right. You definitely need a Congress. You need a parliament. You need one unit that will be making decisions for your society. But that unit can be made up of multiple people. As long as it's a unit that has one voice when it makes its decisions, you're fine. It doesn't need to be just one actual human being. It just needs to be one unit. Onward.
And why should their leadership not be for 1 year or 3 years like the years of an employee? And when the term of other judges and officers arrives, they will rise instead of them and faithfully investigate the sin of the first ones, and that which they condemn must pay all that they have done badly. And this goes against claim 2.
Right, continuity and stability. How could you keep changing the members of your government, right? One year it's this guy, next year it's someone else, and then you have a vote and the House of Representatives changes every 2 years. No, continuity, we need to have one person who will always be there, always make decisions. And the Barbados said, so no, the unit stays, the government stays. And yes, some people leave and new people come in, but that's actually good because the new people come in and they examine what the people who just left did, and they say, this guy was corrupt. Right? He stole, he cheated, he took bribes, he ruined the whatever in our cities. We can now hold him accountable because new people are continually coming in to examine these issues. Whereas the implied point is, if you have one person there always, then there's no one to actually check to make sure that sins aren't being committed in the governance. Make sense?
And why should their power also not be limited, as with religions and ethics? And this goes against claim 3.
Right, so who says absolute power is absolutely needed? Right, you can have religion and ethics hemming in a king. After all, we just saw that in the Torah, that the Torah says that the king doesn't have the right to do whatever he wants. He has the right to do whatever God wants him to do. So why shouldn't you be willing to accept that there will be limits on this unit of governors, of legislators, that will not have absolute power? Sure, but who needs absolute power? The king doesn't, because he doesn't get it either.
Well, are religions and ethics limited?
Well, they are not limited. They are limiting. Right? So, for example, the Jewish king, according to Jewish law, can't start worshiping idols and make that the religion of the nation. Because Torah says, nope, you're not allowed to do that. The Jewish king cannot go out and murder people and take their property. Ahab tried that and got into real trouble for it, because that's against both religion and ethics. I think even in other countries, they would generally frown upon that too. So there are limits to absolute power. And these are two of the primary examples.
And logic dictates that when an individual disagrees with the group, the law follows the group. And it is more likely that the lapse be with one man, as it is stated in Proverbs, the king's wrath is a messenger of death, than it be that the many would trespass when they take counsel together. As if one strays from the path, the others will protest against him.
Right? So who's more stable? One guy that could get really angry and with his power murder you? And be able to get away with it because there's no higher judge or equals to call him to task? Or a group of a bunch of people that if one of them goes off the deep end, the others go, no, you're wrong. Who's likely to be wiser? The one king who's making decisions just with himself? Or the group of people who sit, debate, discuss, analyze, and vote, and even if some disagree, we believe the majority will come to the better conclusion.
There's also the proverb, in an abundance of counselors there is victory.
Yep.
And since their leadership is temporary, and they will have to be accountable after a few days.
It's a euphemism for their term.
That fear of flesh and blood is upon them.
Right, so even if they're not worried about God and ethics, they should at least be worried that eventually they will be out of office. And people who are worried that they'll be out of office and therefore not have the instruments of power in their hands anymore are more likely to be honest while in office. Unlike kings, who never have to leave office and therefore never have to worry about an accounting for what they did. Sounding like a pretty good argument for democracy here?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's remarkably modern in his outlook.
And why do we need to bring theoretical claims for this? As behold, experience trumps theory.
Right, so I'm just talking theory here, he says, but I don't even need to talk theory. We can go look at history.
Look and see the lands, the leadership of which is with kings, and by contrast, today we have seen many lands, the leadership of which is with temporary judges and leaders that are chosen among them, and the king God is with them.
Right, so even though they're democracies, or at least representative officials, people who were put forward as elders of the town, or who were actually elected by vote or not, there were nascent city-states that had some rudimentary forms of what we would call democracy, or at least representation of the people. even if it wasn't like an all everybody raise your hands, it was, the 5 most respected elders would get together to make decisions. That, he's saying, you can look at their life and you can look at the places that are under one autocrat. And the ones that are under small group democracy, changing of leaders, judges that are not appointed forever but actually have to answer, they're doing better.
That's right, the days of the Venetian Republic.
Exactly right. Exactly right. I mean, he's looking at the heyday of Venice, of Florence, and other places that are rising in this.
Did you not hear that a great land governed over the whole world, consumed the whole earth? Search it and note it. While its leadership was through the Senate.
Rome.
Yeah. That were wholesome and many, and their leadership was temporary.
I don't know how wholesome and perfect they were, but he is still making a good point.
However, afterward, they were made a tributary.
Right. So how did Rome end up being crushed?
And behold.
Right. But let me just make that right. How did Rome end up being crushed? Because it made Caesar Caesar. Right. If you want to track the downfall of Rome, you have to have a line of its ascendancy as a republic, Barbanel is saying. And then as soon as they made Julius Caesar Caesar, you're starting the long arc towards destruction.
The Senate stopped acting, and then they stopped passing budgets. The Senate
Exactly.
stopped collecting taxes, and they had just
And eventually it collapses. Right? It collapses as an empire. It doesn't collapse as a republic. Right? The republic was strong and stable. Still not exactly our friend, but it was strong and stable. But the empire was in one long strait of decline. Even if it may have looked successful in some things, it was already rotting from within. And it diminished the power of the people as it went along until eventually it was just a shell that collapsed at the slightest tap from outside invaders. Onward.
And behold, the elected governments have in them nothing perverse or crooked.
Which may be a little optimistic, that elected governments never do anything wrong.
It's relative.
Yes.
No one raises his hand or foot to do a wrongful thing, and they conquer lands that are not theirs with wisdom, understanding, and knowledge.
As opposed to the way kings usually conquer lands.
And all of this shows that the presence of a king is not necessary for a nation, like the teacher of the guide, Rambam, said.
Right. So Rambam made this point, that this was one of the great arguments between Rambam, who came first, and Ramban, who came later. Ramban said you had to have a king, that it was a mitzvah, and Rambam said, no, this is an option, that if you're going to have a king, you have to do it this way. And Abarbanel is coming down on the side of Rambam, which is to say it isn't a mitzvah to have a king. That if we go on with representative democracy till the end of days, we will not be violating Torah. And in his opinion, we'll probably do a better job of it. And yeah, I think you can look around at the world, and as he put it, experience Trump's theory. If you look around at the world, places that have moved more towards democracy have, on the whole, generated better lives for their citizens than those that are in autocracy. And that's something that is very important, not just as an American value, but as you can see from our sages, is a very important Jewish value as well. Good? Good. So make sure you vote in the upcoming election. As I always say, I am much more interested that you vote than who you vote for.